Marx's Ideal of Man by Marek Fritzhand. Marek Fritzhand, author of The Ethical Thought of the Young Marx and Man, Humanism, and Morals, is professor of ethics at Warsaw University. He was born in 1913. The essay. To understand the basis of Marxian humanism, we must comprehend the fundamental features of Marx's ideal of man. As early as the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx equated humanism and communism and proclaimed communism to be the realization of humanist ideals among the masses. Marx never reduced communism to the radical transformation of only the economic conditions of human existence. Instead, he saw in communism the radical transformation of the whole of human existence. In communism, Marx foresaw conditions which would correspond to man's rank of, quote, supreme being. For Marx, the ultimate legitimation of communism consisted in communism's creation of a new free man living in accordance with his human nature and his axiological status. By revealing Marx's picture of man, we thus portray one of the most essential aspects of Marxian humanism. Let us begin with a general discussion of Marx's ideal of man. According to Marx, the man best fitting his model man as he should be is a man completely absorbed in his world and not in the, quote, next. A man who does not brood over death, but fights for a meaningful and valuable life. Life is meaningful and valuable only when life is lived intensely and thoroughly, only when the human being can realize himself during his lifetime by developing all his human abilities and satisfying all his human needs. The human being who lives a meaningful and valuable life is one who finds happiness and consummation in activities which transform nature and society. He seeks truth, beauty, and the good, seeks expression in and through culture and civilization, and absorbs everything new and valuable created in these spheres. He is an active, creative, and wealthy man, rich in human riches. His wealth consists in the fullness of human life, the diversity of human needs, and the variety of their satisfaction. It is the wealth of individuality and personality, forever developing, forever growing richer. His talents never lie fallow. His abilities are never wasted. Above all, he is proud. He prizes his freedom and autonomy. Not a freedom and autonomy outside society, outside the human community, but with people, by people, and for people. Man can only achieve real happiness and perfection when he associates his own happiness and perfection with those of others. According to Marx, human self-realization can only be attained completely and generally if people treat one another as ends in themselves, as the highest human value. A man is, then, more of a human being, and closer to Marx's ideal of him, the more powerfully he is bound to others, the more he owes others, and the more they owe him. The human being that corresponds to Marx's ideal can never come to terms with a world which makes meaningful and valuable life impossible. Confronted with such a situation, he considers himself called upon to fight for a new and better life. He finds a happiness in battle he could never find in the evil reality surrounding him. He looks ahead and never behind. He is committed to progress and to an idea. Marx despised petty materialism. The creator of contemporary philosophical materialism was a passionate propagator of a sublime moral idealism. It is now time to describe Marx's ideal of man in detail. The best procedure would be to elaborate the meaning of three terms Marx used to characterize his ideal man. According to Marx, people should be, quote, total, quote, personal, and, quote, auto-active, end quote. What does Marx mean by these terms? What did Marx intend when he proclaimed the ideal of a, quote, total man? First, he meant the overcoming of the, quote, fractionalization, quote, fragmentation, and, quote, functionalization of modern man caused by the institution of private property and the social division of labor. The majority of people cannot develop all their human abilities and capabilities, nor can they satisfy all their human desires and needs. Their lives are one-sided, partial, limited. They can realize only a minimum of the vast repertoire of human functions. They are bound to one field and one kind of activity. The total man is a complete man, whose self-realization knows no bounds. He is a human individual, not separated by private property from the, quote, totality of the world of culture and civilization. The, quote, totality of that human being consists in his, quote, possession of that total world. Possession understood here as the fullest possible share in the creation and enjoyment of the goods of civilization and culture. The, quote, total man is independent of the division of labor, which cripples, impoverishes, and, quote, functionalizes human beings. Marx was aware of the need for a division of labor and of the division of labor's significance for the development of mankind. Marx was not against a voluntary division of labor, which would do justice to the desires, inclinations, talents, individuality of human beings. He disapproved only of a compulsory division of labor, which condemns people to work in the same treadmill, doing the same things, and performing the same functions all their lives. This division of labor has, quote, assumed a life of its own, end quote. It has alienated itself from human beings, constrained human beings' powers, limited human beings' lives, and their possibilities of choice. Thanks to this division of labor, some people are always engaged in mental activities, others do physical labor, some enjoy products, others always make them. The, quote, total man is a man whose mental and physical activities form a whole during his lifetime. He does not know the distinction between work and enjoyment. He does not know the dichotomy of town and country created by the division of labor, a dichotomy which makes some men into, quote, narrow-minded town animals, end quote, others into, quote, narrow-minded country animals, end quote. He does not know class division, which limits the choices available to him, which defines his place in life, and in the overwhelming number of cases, predetermines his fate and mentality. The, quote, total man will no longer have to confine himself to only one occupation. Marx even considers confining oneself to artistic activity to be inconsistent with his ideal of the total man. In communist society, there will be no painters as such, but only people who also paint. Marx deplores all limitations of man, even those levied by art, which he values so highly and whose representatives, the artists, in many ways serve Marx as a model for his ideal of man. Secondly, the total man is a homogeneous, harmonious man who is never divided by activities inconsistent with one another or mutually exclusive. Marx's analysis of the alienation of labor of the worker provides us with an example of such men divided within themselves. Labor, in conditions of alienation, in a world in which the products of men become independent of men's creators, and become his enemies is something external for the worker. It does not give him any satisfaction and is felt to be a bore and a torment. The worker finds himself outside of work, not within work. The human being is thus divided in two: the working man, who does not feel at home in his work, and the man who feels himself outside of work. This situation is not only a violation of the totality of man, it makes the self-realization of the working people impossible. This situation makes working people's lives senseless and meaningless and dehumanizes them. For humanity, according to Marx, manifests itself in work, understood as a voluntary activity, a product of one's inclinations, a creative activity which gives life meaning and value. Alienated work, however, is compulsory work. Alienated work does not satisfy the need for work as such, but is only a means for the satisfaction of other needs. Alienated work divides the human soul. Alienated work degrades man to the level of a means to an end and makes the development and perfection of his powers and talents impossible. Marx gives yet another example of a division of humanity consistent with the principle of totality, i.e., the division between the economic and moral existence of man, between the demands of economics and the demands of morality. This bifurcation produces uneasiness and the feeling that one is being torn in half. From an economic viewpoint, there is nothing wrong in prostitution or deception, but morality condemns these activities. Should man place his trust in morality or in economics? In the world of alienation, where man's products and relations become independent of their creator and contradict one another, economics and morality exclude one another. Instead of man's welfare being the measure of their value, instead of serving man, each integrated into the whole of his life, man's products and relations alienate themselves and are transformed into destructive powers which divide his life into separate spheres. Then there is only one thing to do. Man must transform social conditions so that human beings can live like a total man, create a society where the various aspects of his life are in equilibrium and harmony, and life is not deprived of its many-sidedness. We can shed more light on Marx's ideal of man by analyzing the concepts of the, quote, personal and, quote, auto-active man, concepts which explicate the total man conception further. For Marx, personal man is man in that sphere of life where he feels himself, quote, at home, in which he acts consistently with his own will, proclivities, and needs, and in accordance with his abilities and talents. The, quote, accidental man, on the contrary, is man in that sphere of life foreign and even hostile to him. It is a sphere of life in which he feels limited and enslaved, in which he acts against his own inclinations, and despite his lack of real interest. Marx could only condemn a situation in which there were two separate spheres, the personal and the accidental, where the accidental gradually overwhelmed the personal. This is a situation which contradicts his postulate of the total man. It leads to a partial, one-sided development of the personality and signals the bifurcation of the individual. This new division, contrary to the ones discussed previously, cannot be liquidated by a synthesis of opposite poles, but only by a destruction of one of the poles, by the destruction of, quote, accidentality. The, quote, personal man, for Marx, is a man who is, quote, himself, who manifests his personality traits and develops his individuality and character harmoniously. This ideal man knows no contradiction between his personal life and his life in society. No distinction between what he is or can be and what compulsive division of labor and class division make him. He is an, quote, active man, whose, quote, activity is of his own doing and springs from his own needs. Creative work is just such an activity. Marx finds it best exemplified in artistic activity. The artist's activity is an end in itself, not a means to an end. The artist's activity elevates the artist, perfects the artist, and gives the artist pleasure. All human work, especially manual labor, should become that kind of activity. Once the spirit of creativity permeates this labor, once physical and mental effort become one, labor will be able to develop people and make people happy. Labor will lose those characteristics which cause its neglect, and will become one of the most valued forms of human activity. Sorry about that background ring. Quote, autoactivity is then nothing less than freedom. Freedom in the sense of the voluntary and unconstrained activity stimulated by one's own profound internal needs. Free activity, according to Marx, is a creative manifestation of one's life that comes from an unconstrained development of all of one's abilities. This free activity is a very important feature of Marx's ideal of man. This freedom can only be obtained through the human control of nature and society. But this poses the question of what relation man should have to his surrounding world. According to Marx, it must never be a relation of submission, in which people are controlled by the inhuman world of things. In fact, people are the victims of general alienation. People do not control their products. People's products control them. For instance, the products of labor confront the laborer as products independent of him and alien to him, as capital, a power which enslaves him. It is not people but capital which runs bourgeois society. Contrary to all appearances, capital even controls the capitalist. The character traits of the capitalist do not make him a holder of capital. It is the capital held by the capitalist which makes the capitalist what he is and determines what he can become. In an alienated society, apersonal factors determine what a man is and what a man can become. The most abstract of these factors is money. The members of society in their respective social classes are slaves to a dead material. The members of a society are slaves of their own. The members of society in their respective classes are slaves to a dead material. They are slaves of their own products, of the social relations and division of labor created by them. In such a situation, the bigger and better the human world created by them, the more developed culture and civilization, the smaller they become, the more they depreciate, and the more fear they experience in looking upon the world. Not only the oppressed, but the suppressors as well, are subordinate to the foreign power of things, although the latter are satisfied with the situation as the situation is. Everyone is controlled by destructive, quote, inhuman factors. Marx's ideal men reorganize social relations along socialist principles and thus consolidate and extend their control over nature. Marx's ideal man reorganize social relations. Jesus Christ. Marx's ideal men reorganize social relations along socialist principles, and thus consolidate and extend their control over nature and society and subordinate it to the good of all. These ideal men are capable of conscious control over the forces of society and nature. They are guided by reason and by science. These people will feel at home in the world around them. It will no longer be a mysterious force for them. Instead, it will become the source of their well-being and material for their creative activity. Marx not only desired control over things for his ideal men, but he demanded that they cease treating one another as things. Their mutual relations were not to be determined by their relations to things. One can best illustrate the meaning of Marx's conception of, quote, immediate intersocial relations, relations unmediated by the forces and values of things, by examining Marx's criticism of the role money plays in the mutual relations of human beings. It is money which destroys the, quote, immediate relationships between human beings, quote, human beings. Friendship and love lose all connection with the personality of the partners and become dependent on money. Human feelings and values are commercialized. Everything can be bought and sold, even virtue, honor, knowledge, and conscience. People cease talking to one another in a human language and speak the language of things. They are able to communicate to one another about things, but when they themselves are at stake, when their own happiness is at issue, they have increasingly more difficulty reaching an understanding, let alone an agreement. Quote, human language, writes Marx, is conceived either as a, quote, request, a plea, and impudence, or as nonsense, end quote. To meet this situation, Marx demands that people converse in the human language, that they cease letting money and other material factors determine mutual human relations, that they permit personal qualities and inclinations to hold sway in this domain. People must treat human beings as persons and not as things. People must consider them the highest value in life. The arguments presented until now fully justify the claim that Marx's model of man is a moral model, and that his man acts according to moral principles. But we must go into the matter in more detail, because there are certain statements in Marx's work which have been used to justify the thesis so often propounded that Marx preached amorality. The most important of these statements are given below. Quote, for the proletariat, Marx writes in the Communist Manifesto, quote, law, morality, and religion are bourgeois prejudices which conceal the specific interest of the bourgeoisie, end quote. In the German ideology we read, quote, communists do not preach morality. Communists do not turn to people with the moral imperative, love one another, do not behave like egotists, and the like. On the contrary, they know quite well that even egoism and self-sacrifice are necessary forms of the developing individual in certain circumstances. End quote. Marx, German Ideology. These statements and similar ones do not prove that Marx's doctrine was an amoral one. They are not inconsistent with the whole of his ethical doctrine. In the Communist Manifesto, the very context shows that Marx was not talking about morality in general, but about the bourgeois morality he always condemned. In the German ideology, Marx was not disputing morality as such, but only moralism, the moral sermons which spread the illusion that propaganda and moral persuasion alone can change people in the world. In both passages, Marx uses the term morality in the same way he uses the word work. He often demands the, quote, elimination of work. But it is clear that he is not speaking about all work, only about the compulsory labor which denigrates man, alienated work. He criticizes morality in the same fashion. He is criticizing a specific kind of morality, the morality which serves the interests of the oppressing classes. In a broad sense, he is talking about, quote, alienated morality, end quote. According to Marx, alienated morality is every form of morality which has, quote, alienated itself and become, quote, independent of man. The alpha and omega of this morality is not human happiness and perfection. This morality reveals itself to man as an alien force which turns against his human needs and inclinations. Marx did not condemn human morality, the morality which recognizes no mediator between man and man, no mediation by God, by the supernatural, or by things. Man, consistent with Marx's ideal, is moral in the human sense, not in the alienated sense. But would that morality transcend, quote, egoism and, quote, altruism by forbidding mutual love and devotion? How are we to understand this notion of Marx? Quote, altruism, in the traditional sense of the word, a meaning Marx had in mind in the context above, required self-sacrifice, the giving up of oneself. But this is not a characteristic of Marx's ideal of man and is altogether unnecessary in the society envisioned by him. The morality of human beings in this new society will not be alienated morality. The morality of human beings in this new society will not be alienated morality which makes an obligation of mutual love or treats love as self-sacrifice, as contrary to the real interests of the individual. According to the new morality, love is a natural phenomenon of human life. Love is the self-affirmation of man and his relations with other people. The attitude of Marx's ideal man is beyond the alternative of egoism or altruism. He feels the welfare of others as his very own. This is an attitude which expresses the unity of the human species and best corresponds to Marx's ideal of man. Translated by A. Ross.